go.
We got 15 people.
I love
Yeah,
it. My
15
God.
people with nothing to do at 3 p.m. Eastern time. I'm so sorry for all of you.
I love it. That's awesome. All right, guys. We're just going to take a couple more minutes here as people trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining. All right. So, Dean, how's your day so far?
My day is fantastic. How's your day?
It's good. It's for everybody joining us. Dean and I were just sharing that we both had some kind of emergency dental work in the last 2 days. I thought I might have missed this meeting, but I'm happy I didn't.
It's funny. That's a good example. If we talk about a particular vertical
Yeah.
that most MSPs, if we were to survey, would probably, unless they specialize in dental, would probably rank as some of their least favorite clients. It's probably dental practices.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's I bet if there's any MSPs in the chat right now, chime in. But my guess would be we'll hear a lot of that unless dental is a vertical they specialize in. It's one of the least liked verticals, the ones where they usually wish they could fire them. So,
Ah, I heard that about lawyers.
lawyers are another one.
It's funny because we have quite a few MSPs servicing dentists. We see it because a lot of them support the Dentrix platform.
Yep.
So I think it's a very popular one, but I never heard that. I
It's
mean,
one of
listen,
the
there's
most
always
loathed pieces of software to support.
is that
Yep.
right?
Dentrix is terrible. Then there's EagleSoft, which is less terrible. And more
Oh my
recently now
God.
there's Open Dental, which is slightly less terrible, but that's kind of your only options in that industry.
Oh my
Um,
God.
and it's funny because if you think about it on paper, they're an extremely technology forward industry. Like
Of
every
course.
dental office always has the latest tech. Generally, they tend to be small businesses where the decision maker is accessible. They have tight externally regulated constraints. You would think it would be a
Of
like
course.
dream vertical, but yeah, like somebody put in chat, they're cheap. They tend to never want to spend money on anything. So there you
Oh,
go.
it's very topical for today's conversation, I guess. All right. Well, why don't we kick it off? I'll get rid of this slide, and then we can make it more conversational. I'll start off by saying, this is meant to be a very interactive session. You'll get a lot more out of this if you raise your hand and chat and engage with us. Dean and I love talking to each other, but really the goal here is to help you guys out with any type of knowledge and expertise or share amongst yourselves. Dean, I'll let you introduce yourself and then maybe I'll do a bit of an intro and then get us started.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Dean. I run Partner Success and like five other hats worth of departments over at Empath. We are a training and accountability product for MSPs. And before I became a vendor shill, I worked and grew an MSP from a very, very small sub-million dollar shop into an MSP that was eventually private equity acquired and was quite large. So
Awesome.
that's who I am. And I don't have nearly as cool of a resume as you.
Well, thanks for that intro, Dean. You definitely have the better background. I will say that room looks amazing, by the way. But my name is Derik Belair. I'm co-founder and CEO here at Augmentt. I've before this I was at Enable and had the pleasure of growing that. I've been in the channel like with Dean, a very long time. Dealt with lots and lots of MSPs. Dealt with lots and lots of customers. And I'll say that today's topic around, firing a customer, I always say firing, maybe a mutually beneficial breakup. It's near and dear to my heart because, as anybody that is on this call, entrepreneur, business owner, it seems so crazy to fire a customer. Every time I say it out loud, I'm like, what are we doing? Like, you love your business so much, you grow it, you acquire these customers, you love them to death. Maybe you love them too much. You kill yourself to acquire them, kill yourself to retain them. And then at some point, there's a conversation to be had about maybe that customer is not right for you. And it's a great topic to have, and I want to make it engaging. I know it's a topic that Dean, you've got a lot of experience in. Why don't you give us a bit of your take on that? On that topic as a whole?
Well, it's funny because in general, the take you're going to hear on this topic, I think, is most influenced by the role you're in the MSP industry. If we go to like MSP Reddit, which is a lot of employees, the solution to every problem is just fire the client. Just fire them, get rid of them. If we talk to most MSP owners who are entrepreneurs, that's usually the very last card they're willing to pull out. And even then, you got to drag them kicking and screaming along for that ride. And I always like to start off by explaining that to employees, which make up more of the industry. Why is that? I mean, broadly, if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a service-based company that depends on you and your brain, you only grow it by saying yes to everything. And so there's a mentality in entrepreneurship where like for a period of time early on, you say yes to every business, everything possible. You need a website? Got it. You want me to do SEO for you? No problem. You want me to fix that printer? Okay. It's turning that switch off and like rationally, how do you tell? I mean, you're a founder. How do you tell a founder, hey, a strategy that allowed you to grow from nothing into something that could hire me is now a bad strategy? Stop it.
I know. It's absolutely crazy. Again, you're absolutely right. I dare anybody on this call that started a business to say that, we always pick the right customers and we turn business away. Like, what you got to do. You're taking every customer under the sun. It doesn't matter what they want, you've got it. Doesn't matter how big, how
Yeah.
small, you take everybody. And the problem is then they drive your business. Like you love these guys to death. You want to service them. They drive your business, and I think people often forget the impact that a customer can have on your own internal business. Dean, maybe you can talk about like what are some of the things that are like maybe some common pitfalls of
Sure.
maybe having not the ideal customer.
So I was a service and operations manager for most of my career. If I were to put on my blinders and only look at a bad fit client from an operational perspective only, with no other considerations, pretty much any client you have that is not perfectly set up to consume your services in the most idealized manner has got to go. Because we know this is service providers anytime. I mean, we know this with our dentists. Like, think about like both of us had previous dental work have a failure. Failures aren't supposed to happen. So right away, we are a non-idealized client for the dentist because you're not supposed to have a filling or a crown come out. So the dentist now has to have some sort of slop in their schedule to accommodate an emergency service. If we're looking at it operationally, we should not be their clients because having that slop goes against being operationally consistent. We tend to excuse that with this idea of that's what good service or white glove service looks like, which is a really fun side convo we can go down. But when you look at it that way, every client is a bad fit client, and also every client is a good fit client. So I tended to look at it from if we sort of looked at our median service model. So we have a set of services we offer, we have a set of SLAs and a variety of ways to consume that service, and there's a little bit of a rubber band around that. If you're sort of within this median orbit zone of that, that's probably tolerable, even if Service Manager Dean is aggravated at you. As you start to get beyond that, that's where I start getting concerned. That client that's asking for things outside of our scope of services, outside of their scope of work, that's constantly asking us to make exceptions, that doesn't follow the rules, that maybe is a little bit rude or doesn't take our recommendations or always beats us up on price before they even hear the price. Like there's all those little variables. We start to look at those, and that's generally where we start finding these clients that to a service person feel like they're a bad fit. And the problem that I ran into in my career is I'm not wrong, but my boss would also be sitting on the other side of the table, like Derik is right now, that would be like, right, but if we fired all those people, Dean, we would lose two-thirds of our revenue, and I'd have to let most of the people who work here go. So I'm like, oh, didn't think of that. It's like my boss isn't wrong either. We can't just fire everybody who isn't an operational fit. And we're not I mean, we're not a company of the size of like Amazon, where we can just sort of say, screw it, let's just land and expand, get everybody with money, and we'll figure that out later. So you're kind of left with you have to draw a line, and it can't just be my opinion as a service manager, and it can't just be your opinion as the owner. There has to be some give and take, and both sides of the equation looked at.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. And I mean, let's call a spade a spade. We're on this call to talk about firing or as somebody put in the chat, sunsetting a client, which I love, by the way. But we're talking about, doing that to a customer that's going to make an impact. That is a big part of the business. I think, we can all agree that somebody that's paying you next to nothing, that is rude to your employees, that is not strategic, you don't think twice about letting that guy go. That's not really what this is about. I think, to your point, Dean, it really comes down to that big customers. They make an impact in the business. There's a lot of revenue attached to it. There's a lot of fear losing him, and what the bridge, or how do you bridge the gap? What's that going to look like? And again, as business owners, often we get, I don't want to say lazy, but we get just, let's just make it work. Let's figure out a way to make it work. I'll
Yeah.
get on the phone with him. We'll figure something out. And usually it doesn't get better. And that's the problem here, is that, as small businesses, we tend to be dependent on a handful or maybe even one or two big customers. And I feel like they know that, and they know they can push, and their relationships get strained. And because you start looking inward, you're never looking like, okay, let's put a plan in place that if this guy wasn't there, what do we do next? And that's really, I think, the point of all this is how do you identify these guys, and how do you put a plan together? Um,
Yeah.
Maybe Dean, you could talk to us a bit about, a bad customer. Like, how would you define like a bad customer or a problematic customer? Like, what makes them bad?
There's so many possible ways to define that you have to add some constraint in. You cannot define it by every measure. You have to pick some definitions that work for you, which is generally why we'll see in our industry, most pundits will tie it back to some sort of financial metric or some sort of risk metric, because otherwise there's too many things.
Yeah.
You're talking about large clients. As an example, I would be really, really concerned if I was an MSP and I had a single client that accounted for like more than 8%, or I suppose if you're in a tighter market, more than 15% of your revenue. Because right away, whether that's your most favoriteest client or your worst client, that's a huge risk if something goes wrong later. And so this mentality of firing the client, sometimes if you take it more of like the pumpkin plan type of idea, it doesn't necessarily actually mean you end up firing them. It's more like, all right, to your example, I have a really big client and maybe they hold me hostage a little bit, but otherwise they're really not that bad. There's just a lot of risk because they make up 18% of my revenue. Well, what would I need to do to dilute that risk if I don't want to fire them? And how many other clients, or how much more revenue would I need to bring in, or how much expansion at my existing clients would I need to make where this client now doesn't control such a percentage of my revenue? And I've kind of fired them from that position of being the most risky, high impact from a finance standpoint client. So there's some nuance when we're saying fire. You don't always necessarily have to kick them out the door, but that's the other challenge, is comfortability is a concept that we don't give enough credence to in service business. We get comfortable with a way of servicing, and clients get comfortable with a way of being serviced. And that comfort is very, very, very hard to get over. There's this saying of this little story. So like this guy moves out to the country and he goes to the country store every weekend. And there's this old man sitting out in the country store in a rocking chair with this old hound dog. And he notices every time he goes, this hound dog is just sitting on top of a nail that's sticking up out of the wood floor and never seems to react. And finally, one day he stops and he's like, I just got to ask, your dog is sitting on a nail and he doesn't react or move. And the old man's just like, yep, he'll move when it hurts. And that's that idea of comfortability, that you can be in an objectively caustic or negative situation, but it doesn't hurt enough for you to change. That's
Yep.
the story a lot here. In telling you on a webinar, like, hey, you got to get over that and get off the nail is BS. I mean, it's fake, it's pseudo wisdom. You have clients that are going to be risky or a bad fit that you are just comfortable with, me telling you otherwise isn't going to change it. So I'm a bigger fan of fine, accept that, accept and own those clients, list them, call them out. These are the clients that I probably should fire, but I'm not going to because I'm comfortable with it. So what else do I now need to do? What else am I going to prune? What else am I going to change? What am I going to increase or improve to reduce that risk? That's a way easier conversation because people like me can go do stuff about it. And people like your owner now are not sitting there feeling as though they have to go and just get rid of a bunch of revenue because some angry ops person said these are bad clients.
Yep. It's such a great point that you make, and I love the risk idea because when we talk about again this concept of firing or sunsetting a client, the reality is if you're doing it and you're doing it proactively, you're in great shape. Most of these customers, most of these big problematic customers, they are risk to your business because if they're problematic to you, chances are that goes two ways. Probably they're feeling that you're a problematic supplier or
Yes.
service provider to them. And by identifying that and just accepting the fact that this is a risky relationship because they're a big part of your revenue, you're dependent on them. If he goes, you might have to fire people. You're much better to put a plan in place in advance of saying, we are going to sunset. Now, we'd love to sunset him in 6 months. We may not be able to, but let's put a plan together on how we're going to be in a position to sunset. The minute you become less dependent on that customer, the relationship will get better. You will be able to make better decisions. You can then have an honest conversation with the customer that is like a bit of a come to Jesus of like, hey guys, it's not working, and not fear that they may leave. Or even worse, the fact that you've identified them as a problematic
Yeah.
customer and not realizing that they probably see you as a problematic service provider. So it's the identification in advance and the plan you put in place so that ultimately you can get to that happy place of saying, I'm able and willing to fire this guy. And the minute you're able and willing to do it, it's like the skies open up,
It's
everything
it's
gets
a very
better.
empowering
It
realization.
is.
Yeah.
And
Um,
a lot of times you'll save them because you can have that honest conversation and say, hey, this relationship's not working and here's why. And a lot of times you can adjust. But if you don't have a backup plan, you're so fearful of doing that that
yes.
you just ignore it and we'll just make it work. And meanwhile, it's like a bad relationship. It's not heading in the right direction. Nobody's talking about it. And that's not a good place to be.
That idea of fear as well, it can be a really hard concept. If you're an owner listening to this and if you're an employee listening to this, that's a very hard concept to translate that we don't do a good job of explaining in SMBs. Owners and people that really have an ownership stake, either real or implied in the business, do genuinely have fear about revenue. Profit is what we're supposed to be going after because profit is extra money. Profit's what pays for raises and new employees and new stuff and the owner's Ferrari and all the cool stuff. But revenue is really the operating money that is keeping the lights on. And most entrepreneurs are very, very fearful of things that will shake revenue because think about like the average MSP has like a 6 month process to acquire a new client. And I forget the exact service leadership numbers, but like I think best in class MSPs were spending something wild, like 35 grand cost of acquisition of a new customer, which is crazy. So you better believe that if I own that company, I'm going to be pretty fearful about shaking that tree. Owners do a really bad job of explaining that fear to their leadership employees. Like in my case, it took my owner years to just like have a conversation with me to be like, Dean, honestly, like I'm scared. I'm scared that if we made some of the changes you're advocating we should make, that we could shake the tree too hard, lose too much revenue, and I can't correct for that. And what if something bad happens? And for me, I was like, oh, I kind of assumed you had all the answers. Like I didn't like as stupid as that sounds, like I never really realized that was something to be fearful of or that you were fearful of that. It humanized an otherwise irrational behavior for me instantly. So if you
Yeah.
are listening, no matter what side you're on, I think that's an important part of this conversation to have within your organization. Employees do not naturally understand revenue fear that owners and like top leadership have. don't assume either way, because oftentimes employees think you're being irrational when you don't move, and you think employees are being like blind and angry for no reason because they don't understand it from that perspective. And that conversation for me was so eye-opening. So like, wow, if I want change, I have to build trust. I have to be able to show leadership that they can trust these decisions, and that means I have to be data driven. And really, to fire anybody at your MSP, you have to have the data to be able to prove they are worth firing. And feelings and vibes are not data. And our industry is really bad at data. So suddenly for me,
Yep.
that was a quest. Like that was like a 2 year project on how do I restructure our data entry at the tech and agreement level so that the data's there. So the next time I go into my boss's office and say, these three clients need to go, it's not a trust issue anymore.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and with all of these data sources, and you overlay things like AI, it definitely gives you a lot of data points, and to be able to identify the customers that are like your good customers, the
Yeah,
customers that are more neutral, and maybe the problematic customers and why they're problematic. So, and it's funny because, and I'm really curious to get your take on that. Are there really just bad clients, or are they more like a bad fit for your business? Like, are there truly just bad people out there, or is it just a fit
absolutely,
problem?
absolutely. So you figure for pretty much every single SMB we're ever going to run into, we are probably, as an MSP, we are probably their largest single vendor spend outside their core line of business.
Yep.
Maybe other than things like rent, there is no other line item they are cutting that large of a check to that is not directly within their core business and then either a direct cost center or a cost of goods sold. And when you look at it that way, that's kind of crazy. Like, so they're spending a lot of money with us already in an industry that they don't entirely trust.
Yep.
That sets us up already that if you get the wrong personality or the wrong type of a person or business in place, you're pretty much destined to fail. So I definitely think there are certain personality archetypes and certain signs you can look for that will almost always lead to being a bad client. If you want a really fun party trick example of that, if you figure out either by asking questions or inference what your prospect or your end client's accounts receivable process looks like. Basically, the sloppier, the more disconnected, and the more haphazardly nonsense it is more likely the rest of their business is also at that level, and more likely they are an emotionally reactive, irrational person. Not a one to one. There's certain industries that function that way on purpose, but that's always for me been a really good litmus test of am I setting myself up with somebody who's almost destined to try and make this relationship fail from the beginning? Uh,
Yeah.
some industries are like that out of the box. That's one of the reasons why legal is and dental and construction are often challenging verticals to work with because that's literally how those industries function. And for an MSP, that's a very like hard bridge to cross over. I think there's
Yeah.
other things you can look for too. We say in our space that we're your trusted technology partner, and some of that is just marketing language. But generally speaking, if a client or a prospect either views you as some intangible, unapproachable, like magical wizard in a tower, they couldn't even possibly relate to you, and they don't even try, that's a problem. That's going to be a problem eventually because the peasants don't understand Merlin. And what do we end up doing? We burn Merlin at the stake. And on the flip side, if your clients kind of view you as like literally like service economy, like the groundskeeper, like I could cut the grass myself, but I don't want to. If that's sort of their entire value proposition of your MSP, that I could do everything you're doing, but I just don't want to. That also usually is a general recipe for failure over time because you're never really going to be able to prove any of the relationship based value stuff that we do. Uh,
Yeah.
other than that, it really, I think, comes down to data we have to track over time, typically financial data and efficiency data, because you really need to be able to track this over more than 1 month. A client can have a bad month, a client can have a bad onboarding, a client can have a bad year. You have to look at things over time to really project this is absolutely not worth my time and they have to go.
That's a great point. I'm curious, I know we talked about this, I think the last time we spoke, but how important is it for business owners, regardless, to do some work to define, ideal customer profile and to look at the base that they have to really see how many people fall within that or fall outside of that? Is there a point in time or a certain level of maturity that you need to get to before you start looking at that and start seeking those types of customers? And I know, I've been guilty in a lot of
Right.
years to just I'll sign anybody. I love everybody. I want everybody as a client. I don't care. But is there a point in time when you're like, listen, we gotta tighten this up?
So let me give you, I'll give everybody here a fun example by way of talking about a completely different vendor in our space. That's okay. So if all of you remember, I assume people here are familiar with the vendor Huntress. When they first hit our industry, there was a lot of excitement around that product. And if anybody here remembers early on, anybody could sign up for Huntress. And they basically had a lower banding, I think it was like 50 like I don't know, endpoints or whatever. It was just free. And so anybody could get in there. They were literally available to any human whatsoever that wanted to use their product. And early on, that was an amazing strategy because they got a ton of hype and all of us really, really liked the product. They basically carved a path for that product category from like a culture standpoint in our industry. And then actually more than a couple years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, they stopped doing that. And they had an announcement they pushed out about why they were killing that off. And they were going to basically have a minimum commit and get rid of the free tier. And there was a little bit of rumbling on Reddit, but it didn't really end up affecting Hunter. I mean, they're a big company, they're doing fine. That is a really good example because it's a short enough period of time that all of us remember of a company going through what we're talking about. They started off by saying yes to anything with a pulse. That grew a lot of excitement. That grew a lot of traction, both in the product category, which helped the competitors also grow big, but also got them this huge base of people they could ask for money. They then eventually got to a point where they had the data to do an analysis and they said, there's a large subset of people here who have never given us money and despite our outreach won't, but we're still paying to allow them to use this for free. We got to do something about that. That's really, in a nutshell, what your MSP has to do. And there's no defined point where that's the right time to do it objectively. It's just deciding when you have sufficient, in their case, critical mass to do it. In your case, it may be enough customers or your ability to go and get new is routine enough now where you feel fairly comfortable you can replace revenue. It could be that you've gotten to a point where you've gotten rid of all your break fix clients and you're pretty comfortable. It's pretty stable now. So now you can start auditing your managed clients. There's no one point in time, but you do have to have that reconciliation. In over time, as your business grows, you have to have it multiple times because we are not SaaS products. Ultimately, a SaaS vendor, they get big enough, can't afford to be anything to anybody. We are not. We are not Huntress. We are not a large SaaS company. We can't do that as MSPs. Even big MSPs can't do that. We have to keep finding what are going to be those points where we go and audit status quo, what good looks like here, who we're kind of reaching that are a little bit above us, and then who are we constantly chasing to fit our delivery model. Gosh, maybe it's about time we go and look at all the people we've been chasing to fit our delivery model and we have a reconciliation there and maybe cull some of that herd out.
That's a great point. It's a great point. And I find that whenever I talk to MSPs, it usually happens at the time when they're doing some strategic planning. They're thinking about how to, maybe grow the business without necessarily having to add a lot of people, how to get more profitable. Maybe they're thinking about an exit. And it's always interesting to look at like what customer, if that customer wasn't there, you could replace with three or four that would
Right.
fit what you do day to day. Like who's on the outside, who's doing something unique. So it's such a good exercise. Whether you fire them or not, it's a great exercise to at least identify them, risk perspective as we defined. Uh, Dean, I wanted to talk. One of the things you had mentioned to me the last time was the operational maturity level and
Yeah.
sometimes some of the mismatch. that was actually really interesting. I'd love for you to share that with the group here.
If I was more prepared, I would have some slides for this. But I kind of developed a working theory that seems to be substantiated by other MSPs I've talked to. So if you subscribe at all to Service Leadership Index or have ever just really heard of any of that material, Paul Dipple came up with this idea a number of years ago of going in and sort of ranking a bunch of different areas of how an MSP operates and conducts business and scoring it on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being perfectly operationally mature, which in theory is not possible, and 1 being barely functional, barely able to even wake up and get out of bed in the morning in an MSP. And all of us sit somewhere within that scale. Uh, so you go and you rank yourself. Many of you have done that, and it's very typical for an MSP to probably be somewhere between like a 2 to a 4 with some fractional value. What I started realizing over time is that same concept applies to our customers at our MSPs. And I noticed that if you start to go through your customer base and sort of rank their operational maturity on their behalf, which is not perfectly accurate, you're making some assumptions, and you start looking at the operational maturity of your clients versus your maturity, you should notice that there's a pretty shocking overlap. There's a middle sweet spot where your operational maturity and people that are roughly a point above or below you, those are probably clients that generally consume your service delivery the way you want. I'm not saying they're priced the way they should be, but generally those are clients that seem to fit what you're doing. If you go more than a point above, that's where you find that you're sometimes maybe struggling to meet the needs of that client. That client needs things. Maybe that client wants 24/7 support, and you're really struggling with your on-call team, and maybe you just hired an outsourcing firm trying to like figure out a way to accommodate that because you know if you say no, they'll probably terminate you and go find another MSP. And then clients that are more than 1 point below you, those are clients you're usually chasing. These are the people that don't show up to your QBRs, that don't respond to things. They go cold on tickets. They say everything's an emergency and then never pick up the phone when you call them back. They're late to pay their bills. They don't take technology recommendations. And when you start looking at that map and you look at it that way, it's a really eye-opening way to then narrow down and go, well, let me just do an analysis on one group here and figure out who I might want to call out rather than having to look at all of your clients. It's really overwhelming. I have some modeling data. I just don't have it with me because I wasn't prepared
Of
because,
course, of course.
you know,
If anybody's interested, they can reach out to Dean
yeah,
directly.
I'd be happy to share it with anybody here. It's not Empath's IP. It's anything. It's publicly available information that I've just sort of compiled together in a way that makes it easier to look at. The other thing around that idea that I think is a really important concept, and it's actually probably the simplest way to measure should you fire a client, is their agreement efficiency. The challenge is you need clean data to measure this. So this is not objectively, do I make a profit on the client? Because most MSPs are not tracking their input data for their cost of goods sold very cleanly. And so we can, in fact, a large MSP when we merged with them, they were like 70% gross margin on all their clients, which is, I mean, that's amazing. That's better than best in
Great.
class.
Choose.
And then I dig into their service stuff and I'm like, you guys are losing money on every service ticket you touch. What's going on here? Oh, they're just really good at selling product. So they were basically, because they weren't tracking their COGS well, the blended margin meant that they were 70% margin overall, but service delivery wise, they were like 20% gross margin. So things like gross margin or profitability are good indicators, but they're so open to like slop and wild. It's like EBITDA or adjusted EBITDA. We can bullshit the numbers to make that sound the way we want it to impress our friends over cigars and whiskey. So what I like about agreement efficiency is basically measuring what could be and what's real. And that is a really helpful way to look at stuff. You take the MRR the client is paying you for service delivery, and then you take the actual amount of service delivery that you gave them in a period of time, multiplied by what you could have billed for at the effective rate if you were just billing it directly. And you do a comparison, and that should give you a ratio. If that ratio is roughly between zero point 0.8 and I don't know, like 1.2 to 1.3, that's probably a healthy client that you should
Yeah.
keep having as a client. If that's below zero point 0.8, you're losing money every time you touch a ticket from them. And if you can't fix that, that probably is something you need to look into about firing. And if they're above like 1.3, 1.4, they're too profitable. You are probably not delivering value in a way that they are going to perceive, and you have a risk there where they actually may churn you someday. That metric is a really, really good metric for pruning your client base because you can't fudge it. It is based on actual time and actual effective rates, but also what could have happened based on your recurring MRR. I love that metric. You just need to make sure you have that input data to calculate it. But that is a very, very dialed in way to know right away these clients have to go. And these clients, I am going to have a problem in a quarter if I don't figure out why they are so profitable. And clients will lie to you, which is the other part of that. Remember, you can't just ask a
What?
client, hey, do you like us? And then they'll be like, yes, I do. Because somebody can like you and also fire you. And somebody can dislike you and lie to you that they dislike you. So that's a really
It's
good
true.
metric.
It's really interesting, and one of the things that I'm always curious, I always ask MSPs is, that, so much of our business as business owners and entrepreneurs, we always look at the customer and we try to look at, okay, how profitable, how much revenue, and how taxing they are. One of the things I find doesn't often get picked up, and it's a huge source for your own team, is how difficult is the customer to service, how demanding, how difficult they are, and just how they treat the team. And I feel like a lot of time, it is so difficult when
Mhm.
you're doing the service delivery to be dealing with a customer that, like you said, everything's always a fire, we're always in the wrong, you guys are always terrible, the guy is belligerent on the phone. That aspect of it's important to track that also. Have you found a way that MSPs can actually quantify that as they do their analysis of their customers? Like, how do you capture that
Heck yeah.
information?
Heck yeah. So there is a psychological bias at play here, and this is why you have to quantify it. There's a concept that feedback feels like answers that I would normally throw shade at an owner for. An owner hears feedback from a single client and then goes and changes the company direction based on that. Service professionals, so your techs, your account managers, service manager, they do the same thing with client interactions. They're going to take the most emotional or most significant feedback in an otherwise sea of absence, and they're going to over index that means this is the great client or a terrible client. And so that's why you have to quantify that. So I look at two things. I want to measure two things there. I want to measure PETA, pain in the ass, but I also want to measure a-hole. Because someone could be a complete a-hole. That is, they're abusive, they're rude, they're mean, but they're not a pain in the butt to service. They're actually very cooperative from a service compliance standpoint. On the other hand, we could have somebody that is an absolute delight. In fact, all of you know this person I'm talking about. It is the sweet little secretary that has learned how to emotionally manipulate you, that hits your service desk with the most disconnected nonsense that you spend hours chasing down, but they're never rude to you and they send cookies. So that's somebody who's high PETA, but very low a-hole. You want to have your service team start tracking that. Every time they have an interaction with any end client where they feel that that has either been a high pain in the butt situation in terms of the effort or hoops they had to go through from a service standpoint, or the person has been an a-hole, you want to have them put a tally mark in because over time you have to look at both and you have to be able to show a pattern. If the service team is only able to prove to you that, okay, the tax prep client we have is kind of a jerk for 3 weeks every April, well, yeah, because that's their industry. Sorry, service team, you need to grow up. But if I'm able to show you a pattern that this client consistently calls in, swears at our team, refuses to speak with my lead female tech because she's female. I had a client like this, and also is consistently difficult, refuses to follow our ticketing process, and is combative. And I can show you consistent data points over 6 months. That's a different story. In fact, as an owner, you're probably getting mad when you hear that. That's a phone call or a meeting. You're probably going to mandate and basically be like, the hell are you doing to my team? The story changes completely when you have your team go into documentation mode. And for your team, it gives them something to do that's actionable. Now I don't stew. I don't go, why won't Derik do something? Doesn't he know how they're treating us? Well, he is doing something. He's giving me a logbook to record the data in. And if I track sufficient data, Derik will go have a conversation with the client because he doesn't want a client that's difficult and mean to his team. It's actually a really simple way to handle it, and it works wonderfully because you get rid of the bias of like the one-time incident. Now they're the worst client ever, and the emotional team that comes into your office and we gotta fire them because they did blah blah blah.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's funny because the more we talk about it, the more it seems like it really comes down to three key pillars as you look at it. The one we tend to look at them first is the revenue cost or the revenue impact. That's the easy one. It's the revenue, it's the profitability. We tend to spend a lot of time on that. But as the conversation continues, it seems like there's also a pretty strong operational cost of having the wrong customer, and certainly a cultural cost of it.
There
And
is.
and it's I think as we look at these customers, these problematic customers, it's important to look at them. Now, you may weigh them slightly differently depending on the size of the customer, but it really comes down to those three pillars. And as Dean pointed out, capturing that information, it's so critical because it's hard if you're just doing anecdotal, hey, what do you guys feel about this guy? Or how do we feel about this guy? It's so difficult unless you can get the data, unless you can be objective. And again, and understand, not just what do we do with this customer that's problematic, but also where do they fit in the grand scheme of where I'm taking the business, where I want my business to go, where the ideal customer profile kind of comes in. It's so,
So
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say some of the clients that we had to let go as our MSP grew, especially as we got to sort of a medium maturity stage and we're pushing, upwards of like $5 million in revenue, were clients we had for a long time that were very nice to us, that people we liked. It was we just literally was squeezing water from a stone. We just could not make money and run our risk profile with them. So I think that's an important call out here. Like most of the clients you're going to fire are probably clients that you don't like for some reason, but eventually there will be people that you love that have been your client maybe for 20 years that you feel loyal to, but there still can be boat anchors there. And remember, every industry does this. We are not bad industry. Like every industry has longtime clients that no longer fit. They have to very politely walk out. And I think one of the power here is take a mindset that if I'm firing a client, that client should be a net promoter of me even after they're fired. And the easiest way to do that is not to just be like, you're fired. It's to walk them through an understanding of why and then help them audit and bring on a solution that is a fit, which is one of the main reasons why I'm a big fan of being friendly with other MSPs in your area. Because that client that was your loyal client for 10, 20 years that you like, but just isn't a fit and just doesn't work with your model now. Maybe everything in your MSP now you're doing is completely CMMC governed and you have a couple of clients that aren't. And it's such a drag to keep doing something different for those three clients. Well, then you go find them the best competitor in town that you know is an amazing MSP that you would go work for if you didn't have your MSP, and you introduce them and set them up, and maybe that's a 6 month transition, and you do it in a way where that MSP and that client are like, holy crap, you're amazing, and they leave a net promoter. So firing does not have to be this caustic, toxic punch either. And I think that
Yeah.
that's something that we don't, the word fire implies, obviously like a very negative connotation here, but you can promote somebody to being a more effective fit to a competitor because you've grown beyond them.
It's a great point. And I'll say when you're able to have that conversation, knowing that the outcome might very well be that you guys part ways, it really the whole conversation changes. Either, to Dean's point, you can point them in the right direction, you give them a soft landing, you give them lots of time. The customer knows that you've got their best interests at heart, understands that there's a mismatch, either decides, to Dean's point, that they are going to take you up on it and just be appreciative of that soft landing, or they'll recognize that, yeah, maybe there is a mismatch. How do we save this? And I would say that I've had a handful of these conversations, and I would say that half of them we were able to save and create a path to getting better. Now, some of them didn't really get better and they kind of fell in their old ways, but it's a great conversation to have once you're ready, once you feel prepared to have it, and knowing and being prepared for the consequences. It's like everything
Yep.
changes, like everything just gets better.
Once you get
Uh,
to the point of consistent service acrimony, you've got a net detractor, even if they don't rate like that. So
yeah,
to your point, you may be able to make changes, but if those changes are resulting in more service acrimony, you've lost.
exactly. Yeah. One of the things you had mentioned on a previous call, and I found it super interesting, is that you said that sometimes a bad fit client can actually almost make your team like develop bad habits. And
Yes.
and I'm just curious for you to expand on that because I found that amazing. And I think it's true.
So there's a whole bunch of different ways to look at that, but um, the example that I generally like to give is so our industry is convinced itself that every single MSP is unique and special. And that's not the topic of this webinar. We'll get spicy another time about why that's not true. But basically, every MSP is functionally doing the same thing. We're all basically the exact same business. We have small differences, but your market's not different than his market. It's all pretty much the same. And if you look at it that way, consistency of delivery is actually really important to a quality service experience. When you have clients that are bad fit clients that consistently cause your team to have to operate in a different mode, your team is going to start to pick up those bad habits and patterns, and then your consistency of delivery starts to suffer. And that's a very, very hard thing to correct after it's happened. It's very much like a child or a dog learning a bad behavior over time that gets reinforced until you suddenly go, well, I don't want that behavior anymore. That's very high effort to then train that out. It takes consistent, like literally, like minute by minute monitoring by you as a manager or a parent to train that out of them. So you really do have to be hyper vigilant for that because most bad fit clients do by default skew from your service delivery process. And generally that starts accidentally at the top. It starts with behaviors like they call the owner or they text the owner's cell phone. And then the owner comes in, in my MSP, the owner would walk into our service floor and be like, I just got a text from so and so. They're saying this is an emergency. And we'd be like, well, we're looking at the emergency phone and it's cold and covered in dust. Like, where's our emergency? Well, can you handle it right now? No. And so for a long time, our mentality was, okay, well, I guess we have to do that, which now means that we've diluted our actual service delivery process. Our ability to meet our normal expectations, our standard expectations has been diluted and changed. An emergency now is meaningless. And you suddenly realize that one day, you're like, well, crap, well, we have to follow our emergency policy. For who? A third of our clients, we do it one way. Another third, we do it this way. And then the other ones, we do it a third way. That's a very challenging problem to correct. And bad clients fatigue your team into adopting those bad habits and those bad practices very, very quickly. The other component of this is really important that I think to bring out as well is like if you think of a modern help desk technician now as being more similar to an EMT in an ambulance than they are a doctor. Your help desk tech gets in that ambulance every morning and their mind is in this, I got to save as many people today as possible. If you were an EMT in an ambulance and you only went to depressing part of the city and only dealt with like, I don't know, rescuing kittens that were left in plastic bags in a river, how many months of that could you do before just the weight of that would crush your soul, right? So the same thing happens on a help desk very, very often when you have a otherwise motivated, culturally aligned, process aligned team, they can become emotionally and mentally and cognitively crushed by always dealing with this subset of your client base that are bad clients. And that will cause the negative traits to propagate down to every single other client. And that's suddenly overnight, your best clients are talking about there's been a service decline, what's going on here? They're complaining more. That's a very hard ship to write once that happens.
Yep. That's a great point. So we've got a couple of questions, and I wanted to fire them off at you, and get your expert sort of opinion as somebody that's done this. One question that I hear a lot is, we've got a customer, they're big, they're profitable, they're in our sweet spot, but they're abusive to the team. Everybody hates dealing with them. They're just abusive. What's some of the strategies you can do to deal with that? Because that is such a difficult
Sure.
situation to be in. What would be your recommendation?
So, first of all, let's not assume malice where idiocy is at play. Why? Why are they being abusive to the team? That's where I would start, because the likelihood that an entire client or a large subset of users at a client are all jerks is very low, because that client probably wouldn't be in business if that were the case. Most people cannot get through life by just being a jerk to everyone always. So there's a reason they're being a jerk at scale to your team. You have to figure out why, because figuring out why sometimes can clear a lot up. We had some clients that were very large in the construction vertical here in Massachusetts, and they were just always combative to us, and we could never figure it out. In fact, we never figured it out. One of my engineers left our company and then years later ended up working as the head of IT for our now former client, which is a big construction client. And he was like, hey, so they have an internal policy here of basically being combative to vendors as like an operating philosophy, because in their vertical with some of the subcontractors they worked with, that was the language they used. So in this client's mind, they were not being abusive to us. They were using a normal business language they were used to. I'm like, well, I kind of wish I knew that 6 years ago, because that doesn't like that's not I don't like that, but that's not emotional anymore. They're not being mean to us. They're being mean to everybody. That's different. I
Yeah.
can I can build a system to account for that. Other times, and what I find most frequently is that clients that are abusive like that, it's typically down to communication and expectations. In
Yeah.
whether or not the expectations and communication are poor on the client side doesn't matter. We're the vendor. We're responsible for owning 100% of the communication and 100% of the expectations management. And oftentimes that's what's going on. And so you look for variables. What variables can I control? Does this client have three principals that I have to interact with? That's a communication expectation problem right away, even if they're nice. I can't fix that. How do I work around that? Do I want to work around that? And we got to a point where one of our qualifying questions we were prospecting was basically, how many owners are there? What's the decision committee? And if the day-to-day operation had more than two people, that would be a negative mark. And we would weight that as we were doing our prospecting, because we knew that's a friction point. There's always a
Yeah.
reason. Very, very few businesses will be just irrationally terrible to you just because. They do exist. They mostly work in dental. But there you go. See, call back to earlier. But it's very rare that there isn't a reason. And finding out the reason allows you to decide if you even want to try to work with it, around it, or through it.
Yeah, it's so true. And in my experience, frustration is such a central part of that lash out, the abuse. That people just deal with this sense of like, I'm not getting what I need. I'm frustrated. This feels like an emergency, and then the lash out begins. So the source of the frustration is always really, really interesting to dig into it and see if that can be solved. There's also personality clash. I've seen it
There
where
are.
some of my guys and some of my it just doesn't work. It's I don't know if it's cultural, I don't know, and especially for us because we're dealing with customers all over the world. Sometimes it's like, listen, you just can't talk to these guys. It's not going to work. Your sense of humor, the way you say things, it's just not compatible. So I think that's important too.
And
um
training helps with that. And I'm not just saying this, I work for
yeah.
a training company. Training in a vacuum won't fix that. If
Yeah.
you have a service team that holistically speaks in a way that just is not compatible with a particular client or client base or culture or geography, training might close that gap a little. It won't fix it. And I'm a bigger fan of just own that as an operating, variable of your MSP, and now more intelligently find your next clients to not set yourself up to fail, basically.
That's awesome. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, and I'd love to. I think I yammered on a little bit too much, but maybe we can open up the floor if any of you have questions. Maybe put them in the chat. We'd love to answer. In the
I got a
meantime,
question. I got a
all
question
right,
for you. I got an
perfect.
investigative reporting question for you that the
All right.
world wants to know. All right,
Oh boy,
so the product is pronounced Augmentt, correct?
that's correct.
Right, like an augmentation, but yet there's two T's. I posit it should be called Augmentt. Why are there
Ooh.
two T's and why is it not Augmentt?
Well, I'll tell you. We started off by the punchline is we couldn't get a good URL with Augmentt, or Augmentt technology was too long. And it basically gave us a recommendation of Augmentt with two T's, but it basically stands for Augmentt technology. We just love the two T aspect of it. And now that's all we think about.
What's the correct
So
pronunciation? Is it Augmentt or Augmentt?
just Augmentt. But listen,
Where
whoever wants to
how
call
many
us, I'm more than
signatures
happy.
on change.org do we need to get for you to change it to Augmentt?
Ooh, I think just one, maybe just me. Maybe this is the meeting where we make that shift.
That's been my
I love it.
burning question for like the last 2 weeks.
I love it. I love it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Empath as the question roll in. I mean, for the Augmentt folks that are on here that may or may not have heard about it, maybe you can give us a quick little overview.
Yeah, sure. So, we Empath is a training and accountability platform for MSPs. We provide an LMS system. We provide a lot of training content, but the difference between us and nearly every other training vendor is we figured that niche training about a particular subject already exists. It is better than what we would make. And if you want to be in a training environment with coaching, that also already exists and is widely available and better run. We're not going to make a better mousetrap there. What's missing? And what we generally found was the ability to get an employee into a system that would actually keep them engaged and aligned with a mission and a goal around training, not just simply do training. That was missing. And a way to hold the employee and the org accountable to that. And then all the connective tissue that's always everything we talked about on this call. Why don't we have employee level training about this concept? When employees aren't going to learn how to calculate EBITDA or agreement efficiency, but employees do deal with difficult clients. They do get confused by the irrationality if we have them. Why? Well, no one's making that. So we try to fill that gap as well with the assumption that you'll bring in training from your favorite places, put it all together on our platform. And so far it seems to be working and it is a lot of fun. So that's what Empath
Absolutely.
is. Uh, Total, very wide net with that. You can tell I don't work in sales whatsoever because that was not the elevator pitch, but
That's
that's
why everybody
Empath.
loves you on this call. It's all good. If you guys are interested, definitely reach out to Dean, or if you want to get more information. Obviously, there's no deck, but if any of the information that Dean shared, just reach out to him, reach out to us. We'll match make and connect the two of you together. Dean, any final words as we enter the last minute of this thing?
Well, yeah. So I'm a troll. So I'm wearing a Cyber Drain shirt. I've got SIP's logo in a bunch of places behind me. I found one enforcer sticker behind me. So I've got options to do my Microsoft 365, my Entra management, all of that. Hell, I could say I'm just going to do it with Intune and Lighthouse and raw effort. Why do I pick you? Why is Augmentt the choice that I would make over other excellent choices? There's got to be a reason.
Well, it's a great point. I mean, from our perspective, we've been really, really focused heavily on bridging the gap between the management and the security. So if you think of the CIPP and the enforcer, for us, we've always looked at it from the technicians first, understanding that a tech will want to do management and security together. We really, really pride ourselves on making the user reporting. That's a big, big piece for us. Is really trying to help the MSP show value to the end customer.
Sure.
Really, really slick reporting, really trying to look at it that way. And I'd say, we really value compliance as a way for MSPs to be able to tell that security story. It's becoming so important lately. So I would say, whatever you do, do Microsoft security services and management. That's important. Check us out. We'd love to talk to you if you're not already a customer. And I'll tell you, we'd love to have you as a customer. And we promise no firing. No firing.
I
It's awesome.
I like the way you explain that because a common reason why we get frustrated with our downstream clients is we will want to, for example, now take on a project as an MSP where we now own and manage everybody's Microsoft
Yeah,
environments in a way that we feel as though meets our risk profile. So we don't go out of
of course.
business if a problem happens. And so
Of
we will
course.
go and find a tool. And then there's that struggle of I want to push the tool down. Do I just absorb the cost? Do I push the cost to the client? How do I
Yeah,
justify this to the client? The client doesn't care about the tool. I mean, you don't, if your plumber is like, hey, this is going to cost more because I want to use the fancy wrench, what do I care? Like, just make the pipe stop leaking. So I like that explanation because that is
that's awesome.
literally why I would end up firing that client if I don't have that value-based evidence.
The great point. Dean, it's an absolute pleasure. We're about 1 minute over, which is incredible. I think we could have probably talked for another 3 hours, so that's amazing. Really appreciate your time, Dean, and everybody on the call. Thanks for sticking around. Really appreciate it. And if you got more topics of discussion, other things you'd like to talk about, just reach out to us. We'd love to do another one of these.
Thanks
Thanks,
for having me
everyone.
here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dean. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye.